No, don't drink it. Ethan Caldwell turned just as a small hand struck his wrist. The porcelain cup flew from his grasp and shattered against the marble floor. Dark coffee exploding upward in a hot, bitter spray that soaked into his navy suit. He jerked back, instinctively upright, his chair scraping sharply behind him. The burn along his knuckles registered first, then the silence. Harbor Light Cafe, usually humming with Monday morning strategy sessions and polite small talk, froze mid-breath. Steam hissed from the espresso machine. A spoon clinked against a saucer somewhere near the window. In front of Ethan stood a little girl no older than 6. Dark curls pulled into uneven puffs. Denim jacket. Small hands clenched at her sides. She was breathing hard. He stared at her in disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged. Behind him, his executive assistant, Melissa Grant, rushed forward. "Ethan, are you hurt?" she asked, already pressing napkins to his sleeve. "Oh my God. This is terrible." The cafe manager hurried over, apologizing. A few customers murmured in irritation. "Where's her mother? This is outrageous." The little girl didn't flinch. "You weren't supposed to drink it," she said. Ethan let out a short breath of disbelief. "Excuse me? There's something in it." He almost laughed. Children imagined monsters under beds and secrets in shadows. They misunderstood ordinary things and dressed them in drama. He straightened his jacket. "That's enough," he said. "You don't knock things out of people's hands because you think there's something in them." She didn't back down. Instead, she stepped closer to the spill. Coffee spread across the white marble in a dark, uneven pool. Broken porcelain glinted like small teeth. The girl knelt. "Annie!" A woman's voice cried from behind the counter, but Annie ignored it. She leaned forward and sniffed. Ethan frowned. "Don't touch that," he said sharply. She shook her head and sniffed again, more deliberately this time. Her small nose wrinkled. "That's not just coffee," she said. A faint crease formed between Ethan's brows. "It smells wrong." He looked down at the puddle. All he smelled was roast Ethiopian blend. Medium dark. The same he ordered every week. Familiar. Comforting. But now that she had said it, he inhaled more carefully. There was something beneath the bitterness. A sharper edge. Metallic. Almost chemical. Melissa stopped blotting his sleeve. "Ethan," she said gently. "It's probably just the cleaning solution near the counter. Kids have sensitive noses." Annie stood up, eyes flashing. "It's not soap," she insisted. "It's like when my mom takes medicine and says it tastes bad." The firmness in her tone surprised him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She was arguing. "Sweetheart," Melissa said, her voice soft but strained. "You can't accuse people without knowing what you're talking about." Annie's chin lifted. "I know what I smelled." The cafe had grown quiet enough that even the older man by the window had stopped stirring his coffee. Ethan studied the puddle again. He had built his fortune on attention to detail, on noticing the small inconsistencies others dismissed. The girl's certainty unsettled him. "When did you notice this?" he asked. "When you were on the phone," Annie replied. He made it different. Different how? He looked around first. The cafe manager shifted uncomfortably. "That doesn't mean anything," he said quickly. Perhaps not, but Ethan felt something in his chest tighten, not fear exactly, but awareness. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Annie's eye level. "Why didn't you tell someone instead of knocking it over?" Her answer came without hesitation. "You were about to drink it." Simple, practical, urgent. He glanced at the stain creeping toward the seam in the marble tile. If she was wrong, this was an expensive embarrassment. If she was right, he straightened slowly. "Get gloves," he told the manager, "and something to collect what's left." Melissa blinked. "Ethan, that's not necessary." "It is to me." His tone was calm, but final. The manager hurried to comply. A pair of disposable gloves appeared. Paper towels were carefully folded and used to soak what remained of the liquid into a clean container normally used for food storage. Ethan pulled out his phone. He did not dial 911. He dialed his head of security. "Tom," he said evenly when the man answered. "I need a courier at Harbor Light immediately. Priority handling. We're sending a sample to the lab." There was a pause on the other end. "Yes, sir." He ended the call. Melissa's posture stiffened slightly. A lab, she repeated. Isn't that a little extreme? Ethan met her eyes. Extreme would be ignoring it. Annie watched him closely. Her breathing had slowed now. Around them, the customers began whispering again, this time not with annoyance, but curiosity. Ethan looked once more at the coffee soaking into sterile white paper. He had nearly swallowed it without a thought. Routine had made him careless. The little girl tugged lightly at her oversized jacket sleeve. I'm not lying, she said quietly. He studied her face. 6 years old. Too young to understand corporate rivalries. Too young to orchestrate a scene like this. And yet she had been certain enough to risk trouble. He nodded once. I don't know if you are, he said honestly. But we're going to find out. Outside the cafe windows, Seattle's gray morning pressed against the glass. Inside, a broken cup lay in pieces. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Caldwell realized how fragile control really was. How easily it could shatter in the hands of a child brave enough to say something wasn't right. The courier would arrive in minutes. The truth would take longer. But whatever was hiding beneath the scent of roasted coffee, he intended to uncover it. The courier arrived in 11 minutes. Ethan Caldwell noticed that because he noticed everything when stakes were involved. A black SUV pulled up in front of Harbor Light Cafe. Discreet but official. Tom Harris, head of security for Caldwell Urban Systems and former Marine, stepped inside with the calm of a man who had walked into worse rooms. The cafe had not returned to normal. Customers remained seated, some pretending to scroll their phones while openly watching. The manager hovered behind the counter. Annie stood close to her mother now, though her eyes never left the container holding the coffee-soaked paper towels. Tom approached Ethan. Sir, Ethan gestured toward the sealed container. Chain of custody, direct to Northwest Toxicology. I want preliminary results the moment they have them. Tom nodded, pulling on gloves before placing the container into a secure transport case. He did not ask questions. That was why Ethan trusted him. As the case snapped shut, Annie's mother stepped forward. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly, I'm Lena Johnson. I'm so sorry about all of this. Ethan looked at her properly for the first time. She wore the cafe apron over a faded long-sleeve shirt. There was flour dust on her sleeve. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot that had begun to loosen under stress. You're her mother, he said. Yes, sir. Her tone carried respect without submission, the kind that came from working long hours and knowing exactly how much she needed her job. She didn't mean to cause trouble, Lena continued. She's observant. Annie squeezed her mother's hand. I'm not in trouble, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Ethan studied the child again. You might have saved me from something, he said carefully. Or you might have destroyed a perfectly good suit. A flicker of something, almost a smile, touched Annie's mouth. But it vanished quickly. Tom headed toward the door. I'll call you from the lab, he told Ethan. The cafe door opened and closed. The gray Seattle morning swallowed the SUV. Inside, the air felt heavier. Melissa stood a few feet away, arms folded now, posture tight. Her earlier urgency had settled into something controlled. This is escalating unnecessarily, she said. We don't even know if there's anything wrong. Ethan turned to her. That's precisely why we're testing it. She exhaled sharply. We have a city council meeting this afternoon. If this leaks, he interrupted calmly. It will be because someone put something in my coffee. The words hung in the space between them. Lena pulled Annie slightly behind her. Should we go home? She asked hesitantly. Ethan considered. If the results came back clean, this would become a story about a disruptive child and an overreaction. If they came back otherwise, he glanced at Annie. Not yet, he said. I'd like to review the security footage. The manager stiffened. Of course. They moved toward the small office behind the counter. It smelled faintly of paper receipts and old espresso grounds. A wall-mounted monitor displayed multiple camera angles of the cafe floor. Ethan stood beside the desk. Melissa remained near the door. Lena and Annie stayed just inside the room, Annie peering curiously at the screens. Roll back 20 minutes, Ethan instructed. The manager adjusted the controls. Footage flickered. There he was, entering the cafe. Taking his usual seat, Melissa sitting opposite him, reviewing files. The barista preparing his drink. Ethan leaned closer. Pause. The screen froze. Kyle, the barista, stood at the espresso machine. His movements appeared routine. He reached for a container beneath the counter. Zoom. The manager complied, though the resolution blurred slightly. Kyle's hand moved quickly, too quickly to identify the object clearly. A small tilt of the wrist, a subtle pour, then a stir. Play it again, Ethan said. They watched it twice more. From another angle, Melissa was visible at Ethan's table, flipping through documents. She did not approach the counter. Annie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "That's when," she whispered. "When what?" Ethan asked without turning. He looked around first. Ethan watched more carefully. Kyle's eyes flicked toward the entrance, then toward the tables, then down. A behavior so subtle it would be easy to miss. Unless you were 6 years old and had nothing else to do but watch. Ethan felt a slow tightening in his chest. Melissa crossed her arms. "That doesn't prove anything." He could have been adding cinnamon. "Cinnamon isn't kept under the counter," Annie said softly. The adults turned toward her. "How do you know that?" Melissa asked, perhaps more sharply than intended. Annie shrugged. "I sit there a lot." The simplicity of it disarmed the room. Lena cleared her throat. "She waits for me during my shift. I don't always have someone to watch her." Ethan nodded slightly. "I understand." He did understand more than he let on. His own father had worked double shifts at a shipyard outside Tacoma when Ethan was a boy. There had been afternoons when Ethan sat in the break room doing homework, listening to grown men talk about layoffs and overtime. Children learned by listening. The monitor went dark as the manager stopped the playback. Silence filled the office. Ethan straightened. "If the lab finds nothing," he said evenly, "we'll address the disruption accordingly." Melissa nodded. "And if they do?" Lena asked quietly. Ethan's gaze hardened just enough to signal resolve. "Then we address something far more serious." His phone buzzed. All eyes dropped to the screen in his hand. "Tom Harris." Ethan answered immediately. "Go ahead." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for tension to sharpen. "They've begun preliminary screening," Tom said. His voice was controlled, but different. Tighter. "There's an anomaly." Ethan's pulse slowed instead of quickened. That was his way. "What kind of anomaly?" "Presence of a synthetic sedative compound, not used in food preparation." The words seemed to absorb the air from the small office. Lena inhaled sharply. Melissa stepped back as though the room had tilted. "Are you certain?" Ethan asked. "They're running confirmation now, but it's there. If this moment moved you, if you believe justice sometimes comes from the smallest voices, take a second to show your support. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next one." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked at Annie. The child did not look triumphant. She looked relieved. "I told you," she said quietly. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Call the police," he instructed the manager. His voice carried no anger, no panic, only decision. Outside the office window, the cafe patrons sensed the shift. Conversations hushed again. Something larger than a broken cup had taken hold of the morning. Ethan looked once more at the security monitor. A routine, a habit, a familiar place, all compromised. He had built his career on identifying risk before it materialized. Yet the threat had come disguised as comfort, and it had taken a 6-year-old child to see what he did not. He turned toward Annie. "Thank you," he said simply. The word carried weight far beyond courtesy. Annie looked down at her shoes, then back up. "I just didn't want you to get sick." In the distance, sirens began to approach, faint at first, then clearer against the hum of Seattle traffic. The truth was no longer a possibility. It was coming through the front door. The sirens did not wail. They approached with controlled urgency, lights flashing but no sound. A quiet authority that matched the gravity settling over Harbor Light Cafe. Through the front windows, red and blue reflections slid across polished tables and startled faces. Officer Ramirez entered first. The same broad-shouldered steadiness from earlier in the morning replaced now with sharper focus. A second officer followed, younger, carrying a small evidence kit. "Mr. 1. Caldwell," Ramirez said with a respectful nod. "We received word from Northwest Toxicology." "You did," Ethan replied. They confirmed the presence of a synthetic sedative compound. Ramirez's jaw tightened slightly. "We'll need statements from everyone present." The cafe manager began ushering customers toward their tables again, asking them to remain seated. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to something heavier witness. Annie stood close to Lena, small fingers wrapped tightly around her mother's hand. Ethan noticed she had stopped trembling. Ramirez crouched down slightly to Annie's level. "You're Annie?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I'm going to ask you a few questions. Is that okay?" She looked at her mother. Lena knelt beside her. "Just tell the truth, baby. Like you always do." Annie turned back to the officer. "I saw him put something in the coffee," she said before he could begin. Ramirez raised a hand gently. "Slow down for me. Start from the beginning." Ethan stepped back, giving space but remaining within earshot. "I was drawing," Annie began, "and Mr. Caldwell was on the phone, and Kyle looked around first. Like this," she demonstrated, turning her head left and right dramatically. "Then he opened something white and poured it in." "Did you see what it was?" Ramirez asked. She shook her head. "Just that it was small, and he hid it after." Ramirez nodded thoughtfully. "And that's when you knocked the cup down?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell your mom first?" Annie hesitated. "You were about to drink it," she said simply. Ramirez looked up at Ethan. "She's consistent," he said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Across the cafe, another officer approached the counter. "Kyle Martin," he called. The barista stepped forward slowly. His earlier composure had thinned. Sweat dotted his forehead. "Yes. You're coming with us for questioning." "I didn't mean—" Kyle began, then stopped himself. "I mean, I didn't do anything. You can explain that at the precinct." As they secured his wrists, not roughly, but firmly, the cafe fell completely silent. Melissa stood near Ethan, arms folded tightly. "This is unbelievable," she murmured. "Our stock is going to plummet if this hits the press." Ethan turned to her slowly. "My concern right now isn't the stock." She looked at him as if recalibrating. Ramirez stood and approached Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, we'll need you down at the station as well for a formal statement, and your head of security." "I'll be there," Ethan said. Ramirez glanced toward Annie. "And her mother." Lena stiffened. "Are we in trouble?" "No, ma'am," Ramirez assured her. "We just need her account recorded properly." Lena nodded, though worry lingered in her expression. As officers began collecting the broken porcelain pieces, Ethan's phone buzzed again. A message from the communications director at Caldwell Urban Systems. "We're hearing rumors. Please advise." Rumors moved faster than police cars in Seattle. He typed a brief response. No statement until confirmed details. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Melissa watched him carefully. "You should let legal handle this," she said. "This could be framed as negligence on the cafe's part." "Negligence?" Ethan repeated evenly. "Well, security protocols, staff oversight, or attempted poisoning," he interrupted. She fell quiet. Lena approached cautiously. "Mr. Caldwell, what happens now?" Ethan studied her face. "Fear, yes, but also something else. Pride." She was holding herself upright for her daughter's sake. "Now," he said, "we find out who gave the order." The words hung in the air. Kyle hadn't acted alone. That much felt clear. Tom Harris entered the cafe again, expression grim. "There's more," he said quietly to Ethan. "Go on. The compound isn't over the counter. It's pharmaceutical grade. You don't get it without connections." Ethan absorbed that. "So this wasn't random?" "No." Melissa shifted slightly. "Connections like what?" she asked. Tom glanced at her briefly before answering Ethan. "Corporate supply chains. Medical distribution. Possibly someone with executive access." Executive. The word lingered. Ethan's gaze drifted across the cafe, the tables, the counter. The familiar routine fractured beyond repair. He thought of the Rainier Valley vote scheduled for the following afternoon. A decision that would determine control over 3 blocks of redevelopment land worth hundreds of millions. He had opposed accelerating the acquisition timeline. Several members of the executive team had disagreed, including— His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Victor Lang, Chief Operating Officer. "Call me immediately." Ethan did not respond. Instead, He looked at Annie. She had picked up one of her fallen crayons and was turning it between her fingers absent-mindedly, as if the morning's events were already settling into memory. He crouched slightly. "You did a brave thing today," he told her. She looked up at him. "I just smelled something wrong." He gave a faint nod. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Ramirez approached again. "We're ready when you are." Ethan straightened. He glanced once more at the shattered remnants of his routine, the table where he sat every Monday, the cup he never questioned, the assistant who stood too quiet now. Control, he thought, was an illusion built on predictability. And predictability had just been broken by a child with better instincts than an entire boardroom. He reached for his jacket despite the coffee stains and squared his shoulders. "Let's go," he said. As they moved toward the door, Melissa stepped beside him. "Ethan," she said softly, "you don't actually believe someone inside the company would try to harm you." He paused. For the first time since the cup shattered, he met her eyes without distraction. "I believe," he said calmly, "that power makes people bold." Then he walked out into the gray Seattle morning, police lights reflecting off glass towers he had helped build. Behind him, Annie stood on her toes to watch through the window. The world had shifted, and someone, somewhere, had just realized their plan had failed. Chapter 4. The Man in the Glass Office. The Seattle Police Department headquarters rose in cold gray stone, a building designed to project steadiness. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed faintly above polished floors, worn by decades of footsteps. Criminals, victims, witnesses, and occasionally men like Ethan Caldwell. Ethan sat in interview room 3. No handcuffs, no accusation, just a metal table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner. Across from him sat Detective Laura Morrison, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, silver streak threading through dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. She had the posture of someone who had spent 30 years watching powerful men try to shape narratives. She clicked her pen once. "Mr. Caldwell, for the record, please state your full name." "Ethan James Caldwell." "Occupation?" "Founder and CEO of Caldwell Urban Systems." She nodded. "You understand you're not under suspicion at this time?" "I do." Her gaze did not waver. "Walk me through your morning." He did. Calmly. Precisely. The call. The coffee. Annie's intervention. The security footage. The lab confirmation. Morrison listened without interrupting, only jotting notes when necessary. "Do you have enemies?" she asked finally. A faint breath left Ethan's nose. "Define enemies." "Anyone who benefits from you being hospitalized tomorrow." That narrowed the field. "There's a zoning vote scheduled at 2 p.m., Ethan said. "Rainier Valley redevelopment. High stakes. Opposition. Community groups concerned about displacement. And internally." He paused. "Internally?" Morrison prompted. "Disagreements about acquisition speed and financing structure." She leaned back slightly. "Names." Ethan considered the weight of that. "Victor Lang, Chief Operating Officer." Morrison's pen stilled. "Why him?" "He's advocated for more aggressive expansion. I've slowed certain projects recently. Would he gain control if you were incapacitated?" "Yes, temporarily." She nodded once. "Temporary control can move permanent money." Across the hall, in a smaller room furnished with softer chairs, Annie sat swinging her legs gently above the floor. Lena sat beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap. Officer Ramirez conducted the child interview carefully. "You're doing great," he told Annie. "Just tell me exactly what you remember." Annie nodded. "I was coloring a picture of the Space Needle," she said. Mr. Caldwell was talking loud on his phone. The coffee man looked around. Then he poured something in. "Did you see anyone else near him?" She frowned slightly, thinking. He looked at the lady in the gray suit. Ramirez's brow lifted. "Which lady?" Annie pointed vaguely in the direction of where Melissa had stood earlier. She was watching him. Ramirez exchanged a subtle glance with the officer, taking notes. Back in interview room 3, Morrison folded her hands. "Your assistant," she said. "Melissa Grant. How long has she worked for you?" 5 years. "Trustworthy?" "Yes." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Morrison noticed. "You hesitated earlier before mentioning internal disagreement," she said calmly. "You didn't hesitate when I asked about her. She handles my calendar, My communications. She has access to everything. And I've never had reason to doubt her. Morrison held his gaze. Until today? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. I don't make accusations without proof. Good, Morrison said. Because proof is what we're working on. A knock sounded on the door. An officer stepped in. Detective, we finished preliminary interrogation with Kyle Martin. Morrison stood. And? He's nervous. Claims he was paid to add something harmless. 50,000 wired to a shell account. Who wired it? Still tracing. Morrison glanced at Ethan. Did he name anyone? Not directly. But he mentioned a corporate contact who told him Mr. Caldwell wouldn't be seriously harmed. Just out of the way. And the words echoed colder than expected. Out of the way. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, not fear, not yet, but recognition. He had said that phrase himself once, years ago, during a hostile takeover. Get him out of the way. Power had its own vocabulary. Morrison turned back to Ethan. We'll be interviewing your assistant next. At that exact moment, in the lobby, Melissa Grant stood near the vending machines, phone pressed to her ear. They're asking about Victor, she whispered sharply. This is getting out of control. A pause. No, he hasn't said anything definitive. Another pause. I told you this was risky. She lowered her voice further. If they trace the transfer, the call ended abruptly. She turned and found Tom Harris standing 10 feet away, arms folded. Everything all right, Miss Grant? He asked evenly. Her expression reset instantly. Of course, just managing damage control. Tom gave a small nod. Detective Morrison would like a word. Back in the interview room, Ethan remained seated alone for several minutes. Silence pressed against the walls. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself to sit inside a single, unguarded thought. Someone tried to remove me, not just harm. Remove. He thought of Annie's small hand knocking the cup away. Of the strange smell she described. Of the way Melissa had tried to minimize. Trust, he realized, was not shattered loudly. It cracked in quiet moments. The door opened again. Morrison returned. We're executing a warrant to examine financial communications within your executive team, she said plainly. If someone inside your organization orchestrated this, we'll find it. Ethan nodded. I'll cooperate fully. She studied him. You don't seem surprised. I built an empire in real estate, he said. You don't do that without learning how close ambition sits to betrayal. Across the hall, Annie yawned softly. Lena brushed a hand over her daughter's hair. Are we going home soon? Annie asked. Yes, baby, Lena whispered, but neither of them knew yet how much their lives had just shifted. Back in interview room 3, Morrison leaned forward slightly. One more question, Mr. Caldwell. He met her eyes. If this leads where it appears to be leading, are you prepared for what it will cost you? Ethan did not answer immediately. Through the small window behind her, he could see Seattle's skyline rising beyond the precinct glass towers reflecting afternoon light. He had built half of them. Power was something he understood. Loss was something he had learned to avoid. But exposure? Exposure stripped away illusion. Yes, he said finally, because somewhere in the city, a 6-year-old girl had trusted her instinct over fear, and he could not do less. By late afternoon, the sky over Seattle had turned the color of brushed steel. Ethan Caldwell stood alone in his glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Urban Systems headquarters, looking down at a city that suddenly felt less stable than it had that morning. Inside the conference room behind him, Victor Lang was speaking in low, controlled tones to 2 board members. Ethan could see their reflections in the glass-tight mouths, crossed arms, the posture of people who sensed volatility. Power always smelled it first. Tom Harris entered quietly. Detective Morrison's team has executed the warrants, he said. They're combing through financial transfers and internal communications. Ethan nodded. And Melissa? She's being interviewed separately. A long pause hung between them. Tom lowered his voice. You still trust her? Trust. The word felt heavier than usual. I trusted her at 9 this morning, Ethan said. That feels like another lifetime. Tom didn't reply. He had been with Ethan since the early days, back when Caldwell Urban Systems had operated out of a rented office above a hardware store. Tom had watched Ethan negotiate with bankers who saw him as reckless, with city officials who dismissed him as ambitious but naive. Ambition had aged them both. Now the threat was not external competition. It was internal rot. Ethan turned from the window. Set up a full executive meeting for tomorrow morning. I want everyone present. Tom hesitated. That could escalate things. It already is. Across town, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Capitol Hill, Lena sat at the small kitchen table while Annie colored quietly beside her. The hum of dryers below vibrated faintly through the floor. You were very brave today, Lena said softly. Annie shrugged, still focused on her crayons. It smelled funny. Still, Lena pressed gently. That was a big thing you did. Annie looked up, brown eyes steady. Mommy, why did that lady look mad when I said it was the assistant? Lena froze. What lady? The one in the gray suit. She looked at me like I did something bad. Lena swallowed. Sometimes grown-ups don't like being questioned. Even if they're wrong, the innocence of it hurt. Especially then, Lena said quietly. Annie returned to coloring. Lena leaned back in her chair, exhaustion pressing down. She had worked double shifts for years to keep Annie in a decent school district. She had endured subtle slights from customers who saw her uniform before they saw her face. And today, her daughter had stepped into a battle between powerful adults without hesitation. Pride warred with fear. At police headquarters, Detective Morrison stared at a bank statement projected on the wall. Here, she said, tapping the screen, a wire transfer. $50,000. Routed through a Delaware shell corporation. Originating from a private investment account linked to Lang Development Holdings. Victor Lang. Officer Ramirez exhaled slowly. That's your corporate contact. Looks that way. But here's the twist, Ramirez added, pulling up another document. Melissa Grant's name is on the authorizing paperwork. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Joint signatory? Looks like she processed it. Morrison leaned back. So is she a pawn, she murmured. Or a partner. Back at Caldwell headquarters, Victor Lang entered Ethan's office without knocking. A subtle breach of etiquette. Hell of a day, Victor said lightly. Tall, athletic, mid-40s. Silver at the temples. The kind of man who wore confidence like a tailored coat. Ethan gestured toward the seating area. Sit. Victor remained standing. I assume the police have already contacted you, Ethan said. Victor smiled faintly. Of course. They're casting a wide net. Financial records don't lie. Victor's eyes flickered. Just briefly. You think I had something to do with this? He asked, voice perfectly measured. I think someone wanted me removed before tomorrow's vote. Victor spread his hands. You've made enemies. Yes, Ethan agreed. But I usually know who they are. A beat passed. Victor stepped closer. You've slowed growth, Ethan. You've diluted returns chasing public image rehabilitation. Affordable housing concessions. Community forums. The board is nervous. And poisoning me would stabilize them? Ethan asked coldly. Victor's jaw tightened. That's an outrageous accusation. I didn't accuse. Ethan replied evenly. I observed. For a moment, neither man spoke. The city shimmered behind them in the fading light. You're letting that child's imagination cloud your judgment, Victor said finally. Ethan's voice dropped. She smelled something none of us did. Victor scoffed softly. Children imagine monsters in closets. Sometimes, Ethan said. The monster is standing in the room. Victor held his gaze, then turned toward the door. Be careful, Ethan, he said. You're about to destabilize your own company. The door closed behind him. Tom re-entered seconds later. Well? He's scared, Ethan said quietly. Good. No, Ethan corrected. Dangerous. At the precinct, Melissa Grant sat across from Detective Morrison. Her mascara had smudged slightly. Whether from stress or calculation, Morrison couldn't yet tell. I didn't know what it was, Melissa insisted. Victor told me it was a harmless sedative. A stunt. To delay the vote. And you thought that was acceptable? Morrison asked evenly. Melissa's composure cracked. You don't understand corporate warfare, she snapped. People lose millions over timing. And people lose their lives over arsenic. Melissa went pale. I didn't know it was poison. Wire transfers don't process themselves. Tears slid down her cheeks. I just handled paperwork. Morrison studied her. You handled access, she said softly. You knew his schedule, his habits, His coffee. Melissa looked away. Back in Capitol Hill, Lena's phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Brooks?" A calm female voice asked. "This is Detective Morrison. I wanted to update you." Lena listened carefully, heart pounding. "They've found financial evidence linking Mr. Caldwell's COO to the payment," Morrison said. "Your daughter's testimony was crucial." Lena looked at Annie, who was now humming to herself. "She's 6, Lena said quietly. "She shouldn't have to carry things like this." "I know," Morrison replied. "But sometimes courage doesn't check age first." After the call ended, Lena sat still for a long moment. Up in his penthouse, Ethan stood alone on the balcony as night settled over Seattle. Wind moved through the air like a whisper. He thought about trust, about power, about how thin the line was between leadership and control. He had built structures of steel and glass, but loyalty? That was something far more fragile. Behind him, his phone buzzed. A message from Detective Morrison. "We're moving to arrest Victor Lang tonight." Ethan stared at the skyline. Some foundations cracked loudly. Others split beneath the surface long before anyone noticed. Tomorrow would not be about zoning votes anymore. It would be about reckoning. Victor Lang was arrested at 9:17 p.m. The timing was deliberate. Detective Morrison believed in visibility. If corruption had operated in shadows, then justice would step into fluorescent light. 2 patrol cars pulled into the circular drive of Caldwell Urban Systems headquarters just as late-shift employees were leaving. Blue and red lights reflected off the mirrored glass facade, turning the building Ethan had designed into a fractured prism. Victor exited the lobby, flanked by officers, wrists secured in front of him. His suit was still immaculate. His expression, however, had shifted from polished composure to something tighter, controlled fury, edged with disbelief. Ethan watched from his office window above. He did not smile. He did not feel triumph. He felt the weight of consequence. Tom stood beside him. "It's done." "No," Ethan said quietly. "It's begun." Downstairs, cameras had already gathered. Seattle's media machine moved quickly when money and scandal intersected. A reporter called out, "Mr. Lang, did you attempt to poison your CEO?" Victor paused just long enough to look toward the upper floors, toward Ethan's office. Their eyes did not meet, but the message traveled anyway. "This isn't over." Inside the police vehicle, Victor leaned back against the seat. "You're making a mistake," he told Morrison calmly. "We have wire transfers," she replied. "We have the barista's statement. We have your assistant's digital authorization trail. You have circumstantial connections," Victor countered. "Corporate strategy isn't a crime. Arsenic is," Morrison said evenly. At the precinct, paperwork began its slow, methodical march. Charges, attempted murder, the words carried weight. Across town, Lena turned off the television the moment Victor's arrest flashed across the screen. Annie had been brushing her teeth. "Was that the coffee man?" Annie asked through toothpaste foam. "No, baby," Lena said softly. "That was someone who made a very bad choice. Is he going to jail?" "Yes." Annie considered that seriously. "Will he have to say sorry?" Lena paused. "I hope so." But she knew apologies did not erase intent. Back in his penthouse, Ethan poured himself a glass of water. He had not touched whiskey since the incident. The sharp scent of the lab report still lingered in memory, the sterile language describing arsenic levels, enough to cause severe organ damage, enough to alter a life. He set the glass down untouched. His phone buzzed again. "Detective Morrison. He's processing now," she said. "Melissa Grant is cooperating." "In exchange?" Ethan asked. "Reduced charges if she testifies fully." He nodded, though she could not see it. "And the board?" she asked. "They'll survive. Will you?" The question lingered. "I've survived worse," Ethan said. But as he hung up, he realized something uncomfortable. He had survived competition, market crashes, hostile takeovers. He had never survived betrayal this close. The next morning, Caldwell Urban Systems felt different. Employees spoke in hushed tones near elevators. News vans remained parked outside. Headlines scrolled across financial news tickers. "Corporate poison plot. CEO targeted in internal power struggle." Ethan entered through the main lobby rather than the private garage. It was intentional. Confrontation required presence. As he walked past reception, An older security guard named Harold straightened. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," Harold said, voice steady. "Morning, Harold. How's your wife's recovery?" Harold blinked in surprise. She's doing better, sir. Physical therapy twice a week." "Good," Ethan said. "Tell her I'm glad." He continued toward the elevators. Small acknowledgement, but deliberate. On the executive floor, the board sat waiting. 6 members, most over 50. All seasoned enough to recognize crisis when it knocked. Margaret Whitmore, the eldest, spoke first. "This is catastrophic publicity." "It's also clarity," Ethan replied. "You're suggesting this was entirely Victor's doing?" "Yes. And you bear no responsibility?" Another member pressed. Ethan did not flinch. "I built a culture where ambition thrived," he said. "If that ambition metastasized, that is partly on me." The room fell quiet. Honesty was not the expected currency in corporate defense. Margaret folded her hands. "What do you intend to do?" Ethan walked to the window overlooking the city. "Proceed with the Rainier vote," he said, "and expand the affordable housing commitment from 15% to 30%. Murmurs erupted. "That will cut margins," someone argued. "It will stabilize legacy," Ethan replied. "This company was nearly destroyed by internal greed. We correct that by building something that serves more than shareholders." "You're reacting emotionally," a board member said sharply. "Yes," Ethan agreed. For once, silence again. Emotion had been absent from Caldwell Urban Systems for years. After the meeting, Ethan returned to his office. Tom closed the door behind him. "You're shifting direction." "I am. Because of Annie?" Ethan thought of the small girl pointing at spilled coffee on marble floor. "Because she noticed." "Because I've been optimizing profit for 2 decades, Ethan said quietly, "and nearly lost my life to someone optimizing power." Tom nodded slowly. At Capitol Hill Elementary, Annie sat cross-legged during morning reading circle. Her teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, mid-50s with kind eyes behind reading glasses, had seen the news. She knelt beside Annie gently. "You were very brave," she said softly. Annie shrugged again. "I just didn't want him to drink it." Mrs. Alvarez smiled faintly. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't complicated." Later that afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside Lena's building. Ethan stepped out alone. No cameras, no entourage. Lena opened the door cautiously. "Yes, I wanted to thank you," Ethan said simply. "You already did," Lena replied. "I didn't do it properly." Annie peeked around her mother's side. "You're not drinking coffee anymore?" she asked. Ethan almost smiled. "Not today." He crouched to her level. "You saved my life." Annie studied him. "I just told the truth." He nodded slowly. "That's usually what saves people." He stood and looked at Lena. "I'd like to establish a scholarship fund in Annie's name," he said, "for children in service industry families. Full tuition support through high school." Lena's eyes widened. "That's not necessary." "It's not charity," Ethan said. "It's recognition." She hesitated. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing." She searched his face for calculation. Found none. Behind him, the city hummed with its usual rhythm: traffic, sirens, distant construction. But something had shifted. Power had been confronted. Betrayal had been exposed. And a 6-year-old girl had altered the course of a corporation. Ethan extended his hand not as a billionaire, but as a man recalibrating his understanding of worth. Lena took it. In that handshake was no contract, only acknowledgement. Seattle woke to headlines that did not fade. Corporate coup charged in poison plot. CEO survives alleged internal power grab. Child witness prevents tragedy. By mid-morning, news vans had multiplied outside Caldwell Urban Systems. Commentators debated corporate ethics. Financial analysts speculated about stock volatility. Social media carved the story into sharp, simplified narratives. But inside the building, the mood was quieter, heavier. Ethan stood in the executive conference room, looking at the long walnut table where Victor Lang had once sat at his right hand. Power rearranged itself quickly after an arrest. Margaret Whitmore cleared her throat. "The markets opened down 6%. They'll recover," Ethan replied, "if investors believe governance is stable." "It will be." Another board member leaned forward. "You've announced a scholarship fund. You've expanded affordable housing commitments. Some are calling this reputation repair." Ethan met his gaze calmly. "Call it what you like. It's overdue. Margaret studied him carefully. She had watched Ethan for 20 years, watched him climb, negotiate, dominate. What she saw now unsettled her not because it was weak, but because it was different. "You're changing the company's direction," she said. "I'm correcting it." After the meeting, Ethan retreated to his office. Tom followed, closing the door softly. "Public sentiment is actually trending in your favor," Tom said. "People love the story of a powerful man saved by a child." Ethan walked toward the window. "I don't want to be a story," he said quietly. "I want to be responsible." Tom hesitated. "Victor's legal team is aggressive. They're suggesting you created a hostile work environment that pressured him into extreme measures." Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Accountability often arrives disguised as accusation." Across town, at Capitol Hill Elementary, Annie's classmates stared at her during recess. "Did you really stop a bad guy?" one boy asked. Annie shrugged. "He wasn't bad. He just made a bad choice." Mrs. Alvarez watched from the edge of the playground. She had taught long enough to know that attention, good or bad, could distort a child. She knelt beside Annie when the bell rang. "You don't have to answer every question," she said gently. "I don't mind," Annie replied. "It's just coffee." Mrs. Alvarez smiled softly. Children had a way of reducing adult chaos to simple truths. That afternoon, Lena returned to Café Solstice for her shift. The cafe had always been warm, earth-toned walls, local art, jazz humming softly through the speakers. Today it felt charged. Regular customers offered nods of approval. "You raised a brave girl," an older man said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Thank you," Lena replied politely, but she felt the undercurrent too. A few glances lingered longer than usual, not all of them kind. Near closing time, a woman in a tailored coat approached the counter. "You're the mother," she said, not unkindly. "Yes. You understand your daughter's testimony could ruin livelihoods?" Lena's spine straightened. "My daughter told the truth." The woman held her gaze. "Truth has consequences." "So does poison," Lena replied evenly. The woman said nothing more. That evening, Detective Morrison sat across from Victor Lang in an interrogation room. He looked composed again, controlled. "You're overreaching," he said. "Corporate maneuvering is not conspiracy. Arsenic is not maneuvering," Morrison replied. "You can't prove I intended lethal harm." "We don't need to," she said calmly. "Intent to incapacitate is sufficient." Victor leaned forward slightly. "Ethan Caldwell built an empire by displacing working families. And now he's playing philanthropist because a little girl embarrassed him." Morrison didn't react. "This isn't about image," she said. "It's about your signature on a transfer." Victor's jaw tightened. "He made me obsolete," Victor said quietly. "Slowing expansion, prioritizing optics over dominance. And that justified poisoning him?" Victor looked away. Silence settled between them. Back at his penthouse, Ethan sat alone at the dining table, 40 feet of polished wood designed for gatherings that rarely happened. He scrolled through financial projections, numbers, margins, stability forecasts. For 20 years, numbers had been clarity. Now they felt insufficient. His phone buzzed. A text from Lena. Annie asked if you're okay. He stared at the screen longer than necessary before replying. "Tell her I am. And thank her again." A pause, then another message. "She says next time don't ignore your nose." A small breath of laughter escaped him. Wisdom did not require age. The following morning, Ethan visited Café Solstice again. No media, no announcement, just presence. The staff stiffened slightly when he entered. Kyle's replacement, a young woman studying business at the University of Washington, prepared his coffee carefully. Ethan watched the process, not suspicious, attentive. When Lena stepped from the kitchen, she seemed surprised. "You don't have to keep coming here," she said. "I know." He picked up the cup, inhaled deliberately. "Smells like coffee," he said. She almost smiled. They sat at a small table near the window. Outside, autumn leaves moved along the sidewalk in soft spirals. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, "about culture. About what I allowed to grow inside my company." Lena listened quietly. "My father worked construction his whole life," Ethan continued. "He believed integrity was the only currency that didn't fluctuate." "And you forgot?" she asked gently. "I optimized it. For profit." "Yes." She considered him. "Children don't optimize," she said. "They just react. Instinctively." Honestly, he nodded. Silence settled comfortably between them. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to sit without calculating the next move. Later that afternoon, Caldwell Urban Systems stock began to rebound. Public confidence stabilized. The Rainier Valley vote passed with expanded affordable housing requirements. News outlets framed it as a corporate course correction born from crisis, but Ethan knew better. Correction implied error. This felt more like awakening. That evening, as the city lights flickered on, Ethan stood once more on his balcony. Below, traffic flowed like veins through concrete arteries. He thought about how easily his life could have narrowed to a hospital bed, how power had nearly been undone by ambition unchecked, and how salvation had come not from influence, but from a child who refused to stay silent. Control had always been his fortress. Now he understood something deeper. Vigilance was not paranoia. It was care, and care required attention. Inside, his phone vibrated again. Detective Morrison. "Victor's being held without bail," she said. "Trial will move quickly." "Good. There's something else," she added. "Corporate crimes like this don't happen in isolation. We're still digging." Ethan felt the faintest shift in his chest. "You think someone else is involved?" "I think ambition rarely operates alone." He looked out at the skyline, glass towers, steel skeletons, reflections layered over reflections. "Keep digging," he said quietly, because foundations did not crack without pressure, and somewhere beneath the visible betrayal, there might still be fault lines waiting to surface. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Victor Lang sat at the defense table in a navy suit that fit as sharply as ever, though something in his posture had dulled. The arrogance was still there, but thinner now, like a suit worn too many times without alteration. Ethan Caldwell entered quietly and took a seat in the second row. He did not sit in front. He did not want spectacle. He wanted clarity. Detective Morrison stood near the aisle, reviewing notes with the prosecutor. When she noticed Ethan, she gave a slight nod. Professional. Measured. The hearing was procedural bail review. Preliminary arguments, but the air carried something heavier than routine law. This was not merely a criminal proceeding. It was a public reckoning between power and consequence. Victor's attorney rose first. "My client denies any intent to cause fatal harm," he began smoothly. "At worst, this was a misguided attempt to delay a corporate vote. There is no evidence of lethal dosage intent." The prosecutor stood. "The substance recovered was arsenic. The quantity introduced into the beverage, based on lab analysis, could have resulted in severe organ failure." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Ethan did not react outwardly. Inside, however, he felt something steady and cold. A recalibration. Victor glanced back briefly. Their eyes met for the first time since the arrest. There was no apology there, only calculation. As proceedings continued, Ethan found himself thinking not about stock prices or legal outcomes, but about Annie. A 6-year-old had done what executives had failed to do. She had paid attention. After the hearing concluded, Victor was remanded without bail. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged. "Mr. Caldwell, do you feel vindicated?" He stopped walking. Vindicated. It was an odd word. "I feel fortunate," he said simply. "And what about your company's future?" Ethan paused. "It depends on what we choose to build." He left it there. Across town, Caldwell Urban Systems' internal audit team worked late. Tom Harris stood over a conference table layered with printed email chains, financial summaries, and organizational charts. "Melissa wasn't acting alone," he said when Ethan entered. Ethan closed the door behind him. "Explain." Tom pointed to a sequence of internal approvals. Victor authorized the initial transfer. Melissa processed it. "But look here." He slid forward a set of internal memos. 2 mid-level finance managers flagged irregularities in Victor's discretionary spending 3 months ago. Their concerns were overridden. "By whom?" Tom met Ethan's gaze. "By you." Silence pressed against the room. Ethan studied the document. His signature sat at the bottom of a summary dismissal routine at the time. He had trusted Victor's explanation that the spending was part of a confidential acquisition strategy. He had optimized efficiency. He had reduced friction. He had overlooked friction that existed for a reason. "When leadership discourages scrutiny," Tom said carefully, "it creates blind spots." Ethan exhaled slowly. "That's on me." Tom nodded once. "It doesn't excuse Victor." But culture flows downward. The truth landed without resistance. For years, Ethan had valued speed, decisiveness, alignment. Dissent had been tolerated but not always welcomed. He looked at the organizational chart. "Bring those 2 finance managers in tomorrow," he said. "I want to hear what they saw." Later that evening, Ethan drove himself to Capitol Hill. No driver, no security convoy. He parked along the street and climbed the narrow stairwell to Lena's apartment. She opened the door cautiously again. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." Annie was sitting at the kitchen table assembling a puzzle of the United States. She looked up. "Did the man say sorry?" she asked. "Not yet," Ethan replied. Annie frowned. "Grown-ups make saying sorry very complicated." He smiled faintly. "Yes, we do." He sat across from her and examined the puzzle. "Where does Washington go?" she asked. He pointed gently. "Top left corner." She placed it carefully. "Why would someone want to make you sick?" she asked without looking up. Ethan considered the question longer than necessary. "Sometimes people want control," he said. "And they think removing someone is easier than working with them." Annie nodded slowly. "That's not nice." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Lena watched quietly from the stove. There was something about seeing a man who commanded billion-dollar negotiations kneeling at a child's puzzle that softened the edges of reputation. Later, as Ethan stood to leave, Lena walked him to the door. "You're not used to being wrong, are you?" she asked gently. He did not bristle. "No, but you were." "Yes, and you're staying." He met her eyes. "Yes," she nodded. "Then maybe this changes something." Back at Caldwell headquarters the next morning, Ethan addressed the entire company. Employees filled the atrium, standing along railings and clustered between glass partitions. He did not stand behind a podium. He stood at floor level. "Last week," he began, "our company was nearly defined by betrayal." A ripple of tension moved through the crowd. But betrayal does not grow in isolation. It grows in silence, in oversight ignored, in ambition unchallenged. He paused. "I bear responsibility for the culture that allowed warning signs to be dismissed." That admission altered the air in the room. "We are instituting new internal review systems, independent oversight, anonymous escalation channels, and we will protect dissent, not punish it." He let the words settle. Power without accountability is corrosion. The phrase echoed. For employees over 50 who had seen corporate cycles rise and fall, the statement landed differently. They remembered Enron. They remembered recessions born from unchecked confidence. This was not just crisis management. It felt like correction. After the address, the 2 finance managers approached him. "We tried to escalate concerns," one said nervously. "I know," Ethan replied. "And I dismissed them. They waited for defensiveness. It did not come. That won't happen again." Later that afternoon, Detective Morrison called once more. "There's no evidence of broader conspiracy," she said. "Victor orchestrated it with Melissa's cooperation." "That's the extent." Ethan nodded. "Thank you. But understand this," Morrison added. "Your company survives because a child spoke up and because you chose to listen." After the call ended, Ethan stood at his window again. Seattle stretched before him, rain beginning to mist across the skyline. Glass towers blurred slightly in the gray. He thought about fault lines. Not all cracks were visible. Some ran quietly beneath foundations, waiting for pressure to expose them. He had nearly lost everything, not because of external enemies, but because he had mistaken efficiency for integrity. And it had taken a 6-year-old girl to remind him that vigilance begins with attention. The question now was not whether he would survive this scandal. It was whether he would become worthy of surviving it. Rain settled over Seattle like a thin veil, steady and unhurried. From the 42nd floor, Ethan Caldwell watched droplets trace uneven paths down the glass. The city below moved as it always had, cars merging, pedestrians rushing beneath umbrellas, cranes pivoting over half-finished structures. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But inside Caldwell Urban Systems, the air felt recalibrated. Not lighter, sharper. In the weeks since Victor Lang's arrest, systems had been audited, reporting structures revised, and independent oversight introduced. Compliance officers who once operated quietly now had direct access to the board. Anonymous reporting channels were established and, to Ethan's quiet satisfaction, used. Truth, it turned out, surfaced when given protection. That morning, Ethan met with the two finance managers whose concerns he had once dismissed: Robert Klein, 53, and Dana Whitfield, 48. Both had spent decades in corporate finance. Both had seen how momentum could silence prudence. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said without preamble. Robert shifted slightly. Dana studied him carefully. "You raised legitimate concerns," Ethan continued. "I prioritized speed over scrutiny." Dana folded her hands. "Speed rewards confidence. Scrutiny rewards caution." "And I rewarded the wrong one," Ethan replied. Robert exhaled slowly. "We didn't escalate further because historically, that didn't go well." The honesty did not wound. It clarified. "That history ends now," Ethan said. He meant it. Later that afternoon, he drove again to Capitol Hill. This time, he brought no agenda, only a small cardboard box. Lena opened the door, wary but not surprised. "You're becoming a regular," she said lightly. "I don't want to be a headline," he replied. "Just a neighbor." Annie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, building a tower from mismatched wooden blocks. She looked up. "You came back." "I said I would." He handed her the box. Inside was a simple children's science kit: magnifying glass, small beakers, safe chemical reaction experiments. "For your nose," he said. Annie's eyes widened. "To smell things?" "To question them," he corrected gently. She smiled. Lena watched from the doorway, arms folded loosely. "You don't have to keep proving gratitude," she said. "I'm not," Ethan replied. "I'm investing." "In what?" "In awareness." She studied him. "Awareness doesn't show up on quarterly reports." "No," he said quietly, "but it prevents poison from slipping through unnoticed." They sat at the small kitchen table while Annie examined her new kit. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, Seattle's constant reminder that life rarely paused. "You know people are talking," Lena said. "About what?" "About you." He raised an eyebrow. "Some say you're performing redemption. Others say you're genuinely changing." "And you?" he asked. She considered. "I think you're uncomfortable." He almost smiled. "That's accurate." "Good," she replied. "Growth usually starts there." At the courthouse the following week, Victor Lang entered a plea agreement negotiation phase. The prosecution's case was strong. The wire transfers, the testimony, the forensic evidence difficult to dismantle. Victor's attorney approached Ethan outside the courtroom. "My client is willing to accept responsibility for attempted harm," he said smoothly. "But he maintains that corporate pressure created the environment." Ethan met his gaze calmly. "Corporate pressure did not pour arsenic." The attorney inclined his head slightly. "You'll testify?" "If necessary." Inside the courtroom, Victor glanced once more toward Ethan. There was something different in his expression now. Not defiance. Resentment. "You could have simply stepped aside," Victor said quietly when they crossed paths briefly in the hallway. "Let me run expansion, and you could have resigned," Ethan replied evenly. Victor's jaw tightened. "You think you're better than this?" "No," Ethan said. "I think I'm responsible for it." The words unsettled Victor more than anger would have. Outside, reporters waited again. This time, Ethan did not stop to speak. He had learned something about public narrative. It often distorted what quiet action clarified. Back at Cafe Solstice, Lena noticed subtle shifts in customers. More people lingered. Some asked about Annie. A few expressed skepticism about corporate sincerity. One older woman, gray-haired and steady-eyed, leaned across the counter. "I worked 30 years in municipal planning," she said. "Men like him don't change easily." Lena handed her a cappuccino. "Maybe," she replied. "But sometimes they're forced to see." The woman nodded slowly. "Seeing is one thing, acting is another." Later that evening, Ethan stood once more on his balcony. He thought about legacy. For years, he had measured it in square footage, skyline silhouettes, revenue growth. Now, those metrics felt incomplete. He picked up his phone and dialed Tom. "I want a full review of all development sites," he said. "Community impact assessments. Not just compliance, actual listening sessions." Tom paused. "That's going to slow timelines." "Good. And the board?" "They'll adapt." After the call, Ethan leaned against the railing. Below, Seattle shimmered in damp reflections. He remembered his father coming home from construction jobs with hands cracked from cold, dignity intact, despite modest pay. Integrity doesn't fluctuate, his father had said once. Ethan had heard it, but he had not internalized it. Until now. At Capitol Hill, Annie conducted her first experiment. A safe reaction vinegar and baking soda bubbled inside a small beaker. "It smells strong," she declared proudly. Lena laughed softly. "Good strong, or bad strong?" "Curious strong," Annie said. Lena kissed the top of her head. "Curiosity keeps you safe." Back in his penthouse, Ethan allowed himself a rare stillness. He understood now that power without reflection decayed, ambition without restraint corroded, and trust, once cracked, required more than apology to repair it, required visible change. Victor Lang would likely accept a plea. Melissa Grant would testify. The company would stabilize. But the real trial had already occurred in a cafe, on a marble floor, where a small girl refused to ignore a strange smell. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had spent decades building upward. Now he was learning to build inward. The difference, he suspected, would determine what remained when the headlines faded. Chapter 10. The Measure of a Man. The plea agreement came on a Tuesday morning. Victor Lang stood before the judge, posture straight but diminished, and entered a guilty plea to attempted aggravated assault and corporate bribery conspiracy. The prosecution agreed to recommend a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation and financial restitution. The courtroom was quieter than it had been during the earlier hearings. The spectacle had faded. What remained was consequence. Ethan sat in the second row again. He did not look triumphant. He looked older. When the judge asked Victor if he understood the charges and the rights he was waiving, Victor answered clearly, "Yes, Your Honor." There was no dramatic confession, no emotional collapse, just the steady closing of a door. As the hearing adjourned, Victor turned slightly toward Ethan. "You think this fixes it?" he asked under his breath, as deputies moved to escort him out. "No," Ethan replied evenly. "It acknowledges it." Victor's mouth tightened. "You built the same machine I did." "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "But I'm not pretending it didn't malfunction." Victor was led away. Outside, reporters waited again. But the frenzy had cooled into routine coverage. The story had moved from shock to analysis. Ethan stepped to the microphones this time. "Mr. Caldwell, do you feel justice has been served?" a reporter asked. "Justice is rarely perfect," Ethan replied. "But accountability matters. Will this change how you run your company?" "It already has." He left it at that. Back at Caldwell Urban Systems, the board convened once more, this time without Victor's empty chair casting a shadow over the table. Margaret Whitmore folded her hands. "The plea brings closure legally," she said. "But reputational recovery is ongoing." "I'm aware," Ethan replied. "We've reviewed your proposed structural reforms," she continued. "Independent ethics oversight, employee advisory panels, expanded affordable housing commitments. It's ambitious. So is poisoning a CEO," Ethan said calmly. A few members shifted uncomfortably. Margaret watched him carefully. "You're redefining the company." "Yes." "Why now?" He considered the question. "Because I almost died. Because a child noticed what I ignored. Because power without humility corrodes. Instead," he said, "because growth without conscience collapses eventually." Silence followed. Then Margaret nodded once. "Proceed." That afternoon, Ethan drove again to Capitol Hill. He no longer felt like an outsider climbing the narrow stairwell to Lena's apartment. He knocked. Annie opened the door this time. "You're early," she said. "I thought we'd celebrate," he replied. "Did the judge make him say sorry?" "In a way." Annie considered that. "Did he mean it?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. She nodded slowly. "Sometimes people say sorry because they have to." He crouched slightly to her level. "And sometimes they say it because they understand." "Which one are you?" The question landed gently but directly. Ethan smiled faintly. "I'm trying to be the second." Inside, Lena set 3 plates on the small kitchen table, simple dinner, roast chicken and green beans. "You don't have to do this," she said as Ethan took a seat. "I want to." They ate quietly at first. No corporate agendas. No court updates. Just ordinary conversation. Annie described her science experiment from earlier in the week. "It bubbled up so fast," she said, eyes bright, like it wanted to escape. "Pressure does that." Ethan replied. Lena glanced at him knowingly. Yes, she said softly. It does. After dinner, Ethan helped Annie with a reading assignment. She stumbled over a word responsibility. He pronounced it slowly. Responsibility. She tried again. Responsibility. What does it mean? She asked. He paused. It means owning what you do, he said carefully. And what happens because of it? Even if it's bad, especially then. Annie nodded thoughtfully. Later that night, back in his penthouse, Ethan stood again on his balcony. The city stretched beneath him, familiar, complex, alive. For years, he had believed leadership meant staying several moves ahead, anticipating markets, outmaneuvering rivals. Now he understood something subtler. Leadership meant staying present, seeing warning signs, listening when someone smaller spoke. His phone buzzed. A message from Detective Morrison. Sentencing scheduled next month. Restitution hearing to follow. He replied with a simple acknowledgement. Then he set the phone down and looked at the skyline. 2 months ago, he had measured his worth by acquisitions closed. Now he found himself measuring it by conversations held, by employees empowered to question, by a scholarship fund quietly funded and expanding, by affordable housing units breaking ground with community input rather than against it. The transformation was not dramatic. It was incremental, and therefore real. In Capitol Hill, Lena tucked Annie into bed. Do you think Mr. Caldwell is good now? Annie asked sleepily. Lena brushed hair from her daughter's forehead. I think he's learning. Grown-ups take a long time, Annie murmured. Yes, Lena said softly. We do. Back at his desk, Ethan opened a folder labeled Legacy Planning. He deleted half of it. Then he began drafting something new. Not a speech, not a press strategy. A letter. To employees. To future leaders. To himself. He wrote about vigilance. About integrity that does not fluctuate. About the quiet courage of paying attention. He ended with a sentence he would not publish, but would keep. Power is not proven by control. It is proven by restraint. He leaned back. The city lights shimmered. He no longer saw them as trophies. He saw them as lives intersecting. And somewhere among them, a small girl who had refused to ignore a strange smell. The distance between wealth and wisdom, he realized, was narrower than he had once believed. It was crossed in a single moment. A moment of attention. A moment of choice. A moment when someone decided not to look away. Sentencing day arrived under a pale, wind-swept sky. The courthouse steps were damp from early morning rain, and the crowd outside was smaller than before. Public interest had softened. The headlines had cooled. But inside, the gravity remained. Ethan entered quietly, as he had before. No entourage. No statement prepared. Victor Lang stood once again before the bench, his attorney at his side. The judge reviewed final recommendations. 7 years with eligibility for parole after 5. Financial restitution. Permanent disqualification from corporate executive leadership. When the judge invited victim impact statements, the prosecutor glanced toward Ethan. He rose. There was no tremor in his voice. Your Honor, he began. I stand here not to ask for punishment beyond what the law requires. I stand to acknowledge the seriousness of what occurred. The courtroom was silent. An attempt was made to remove me from my position through harm. That is not corporate strategy. It is violence, disguised as ambition. He paused. I built an organization that prized results. In doing so, I failed to ensure that conscience held equal weight. I accept my responsibility in allowing a culture where warning signs were overlooked. Victor stared straight ahead. Ethan continued. Accountability matters. Not because it restores reputation, but because it reinforces the boundaries that protect us all. He stepped back. No theatrics, just clarity. The judge delivered the sentence. 7 years. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter closed. Outside, reporters waited, but Ethan did not stop this time. He walked past microphones, past flashing cameras, into the steady rhythm of the city. Some reckonings did not require amplification. They required reflection. Back at Caldwell Urban Systems, employees watched the newsfeed in the lobby. When the sentence was announced, there was no applause, only quiet acknowledgement. Tom approached Ethan in his office later that afternoon. It's done, he said. Ethan looked at the skyline. No, he replied softly. It's defined. Tom nodded. Stock stabilized fully this morning. Investors seem reassured. Ethan turned from the window. Good. But profit recovery no longer felt like the central metric. Later that evening, Ethan drove again to Capitol Hill. He had fallen into the habit of these visits unannounced, unpublicized. Lena opened the door with a small smile. Big day, she said. Yes. Annie sat at the kitchen table drawing a picture. What are you working on? He asked. She held it up proudly. It showed 3 figures, one tall, one medium, one small, standing under a bright yellow sun. That's you, she said, pointing to the tallest. And Mommy. And me. He studied it carefully. Why is the sun so big? He asked. So we can see, she replied simply. He sat beside her. The judge made a decision today, he said. Did the man have to listen? Yes. Even if he didn't want to? Yes. She nodded thoughtfully. That's responsibility. He smiled faintly. Yes. Lena watched them from the sink, hands resting lightly on the counter. You look tired, she said to Ethan. I am. From court? No. He hesitated. From understanding. She dried her hands and joined them at the table. Understanding what? That control is fragile, he said. And trust even more so. Annie tilted her head. Trust is like glass, she said confidently. He raised an eyebrow. Why? If you drop it, it breaks. Lena laughed softly. She's been thinking about that since the cafe. Ethan studied the drawing again. 3 figures under a large sun. Illuminated. Visible. For years, he had stood above the city. Now he was learning to stand beside it. That night, back in his penthouse, Ethan opened the scholarship fund documents. Applications were already coming in: children of restaurant servers, janitors, delivery drivers, families who operated on margins thinner than corporate spreadsheets ever showed. He approved the first round personally. Each name felt more tangible than any acquisition contract. Later, as rain tapped softly against the glass, he found himself reflecting not on the attempt against his life, but on the months preceding it. The overlooked memos, the speed prioritized over scrutiny, the confidence mistaken for immunity. He whispered something aloud, though no one stood in the room. Integrity doesn't fluctuate. His father's voice echoed faintly in memory. He had once believed integrity was a static trait. Now he understood it required maintenance, daily, intentional. Across town, Lena lay awake longer than usual. Annie slept peacefully beside her. She thought about the difference between powerful men who apologized when forced and those who changed because they recognized their own part in harm. She had seen both in her lifetime. Ethan, she decided, was still becoming. That was enough for now. The following week, Caldwell Urban Systems broke ground on a new affordable housing complex in Rainier Valley. This time, community leaders stood on stage alongside executives. Not for optics, for partnership. Ethan spoke briefly. Cities are not measured by skylines, he said. They are measured by who they make room for. The words carried weight, not because they were poetic, but because they were earned. In the crowd, Harold, the security guard, stood with his recovering wife. Robert and Dana from finance stood near the back, listening. And near the front, Lena and Annie watched quietly. Annie tugged on Lena's sleeve. He's not drinking coffee, she whispered. Lena smiled. Not today. Ethan caught sight of them and gave a small nod. No grand gesture, just acknowledgement. In that moment, he understood something that years of corporate maneuvering had never taught him. Justice was not loud. It was cumulative, built through decisions made after crisis faded, built through attention sustained long after headlines moved on. And sometimes, it began with a spilled cup of coffee and a child who refused to ignore what didn't smell right. By the time autumn settled fully over Seattle, the noise had quieted. News vans no longer idled outside Caldwell Urban Systems. Analysts had moved on to new scandals, new crises. The city resumed its ordinary rhythm, coffee cups clinking, buses sighing at intersections, cranes swinging steel into place. But inside Ethan Caldwell, something had not returned to ordinary. It had deepened. On a gray Thursday morning, he stood in the Rainier Valley Development Site trailer reviewing updated blueprints. The affordable housing allocation, once a reluctant concession, now stood at 40%. 40. The number would have startled him 6 months ago. Now it felt correct. We'll need to adjust parking projections, Dana Whitfield said, pointing to a column in the revised model. Mixed income occupancy shifts usage patterns. Then we adjust, Ethan replied. Robert Klein leaned back in his chair. Community Advisory Board wants more natural light in shared corridors. They cited safety concerns. Add it, Ethan said without hesitation. Robert blinked slightly. Even if it trims margin? Ethan looked at him steadily. Light isn't a luxury, it's dignity. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. The meeting ended without tension. No one rushed to override dissent. No one hurried to optimize beyond reason. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited Café Solstice again. He still drank coffee, but he watched it being prepared. Not from fear, from attention. The new barista, a graduate student named Chloe, smiled politely. Medium roast? Black? Yes, thank you. Lena stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. You're predictable, she said lightly. I used to think predictability was strength, he replied. And now? Now I think awareness is. They sat near the window. Outside, leaves gathered in amber drifts along the sidewalk. You've been quieter lately, Lena observed. Listening, he said. To who? To people I used to overlook. She nodded. That's harder than it sounds. It is. He took a careful sip of coffee. Still warm, still ordinary, yet it carried memory. Across town, Annie stood in front of her class during show and tell. She held up the magnifying glass Ethan had given her. This helps you see what's really there, she explained seriously. Mrs. Alvarez smiled. And what have you discovered? Annie thought for a moment that sometimes grown-ups don't look close enough. The class giggled softly, but Mrs. Alvarez did not. Children, she knew, often summarized truths adults complicated. That evening, Ethan hosted a small dinner at his penthouse. Not investors, not executives. Harold and his wife attended. Robert and Dana came with their spouses. Detective Morrison accepted reluctantly, but appeared precisely on time. And Lena arrived with Annie, who wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with quiet curiosity. The dining table that had once felt ornamental now served purpose. Conversation moved slowly at first. Weather, work, city updates. Then Morrison cleared her throat. You know, she said, glancing at Ethan. Most corporate crises end with containment, not reflection. Ethan smiled faintly. I've spent years containing, and now? Now I'm examining. Harold lifted his glass. To examination, he said. They clinked gently. Annie tugged at Ethan's sleeve. Can I see the balcony? He led her outside. The skyline shimmered. It's high, she said. Yes. Do you feel small up here? He considered the question carefully. Sometimes, he admitted. That's good, she said. Why? Because then you remember other people are big too. He looked down at the city. She was right. Height did not equal importance. Perspective did. Inside, Lena stood beside Morrison. You trust him? Morrison asked quietly. I trust that he's trying, Lena replied. Morrison nodded slowly. That's more than most. Dinner ended not with speeches, but with shared laughter. Simple, unstaged. After guests departed, Ethan stood alone in the dimly lit dining room. The table bore remnants of connection, half-empty glasses, folded napkins, the echo of conversation. For years, he had measured evenings by productivity. Tonight, he measured it by presence. The next week, Caldwell Urban Systems launched a new internal initiative, the Attentive Leadership Program. Not a branding exercise, a requirement. Executives were assigned community shadow days working alongside maintenance crews, city planners, service staff. Listening sessions replaced closed-door briefings. Quarterly performance reviews now included an integrity metric, peer evaluations focused on transparency and accountability. Some resisted quietly. Change rarely moved without friction, but the tone had shifted, not imposed from above, modeled. One afternoon, as Ethan exited the building, a young intern approached hesitantly. Mr. Caldwell? Yes? I just wanted to say, the new reporting system had helped. How? I flagged a vendor irregularity. It got reviewed. No backlash. Ethan nodded slowly. Good. The intern hesitated. Thank you. As she walked away, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not pride. Stewardship. Back at Capitol Hill, Annie sat at the kitchen table again, drawing. This time, the picture showed a tall building, but its windows were open, and small figures stood at each one. What's this? Lena asked. It's his building, Annie said. But everyone can see out. Lena kissed her forehead. Maybe that's the point. Weeks later, as winter edged closer, Ethan returned to the courthouse not as a witness, but as an observer. Victor Lang's formal sentencing had concluded. Restitution orders were in place. As Victor was led down the hallway, their paths crossed one last time. Victor stopped briefly. You're rebuilding your image, he said flatly. Ethan met his eyes. No, he replied. I'm rebuilding my foundation. Victor searched his face for sarcasm. Found none. He said nothing more. Outside, the wind carried a sharper bite. Ethan stood on the courthouse steps and inhaled deeply. The air smelled clean, ordinary, real. He understood now that crisis had not been the defining event. Choice had. A 6-year-old had made one. He had made another. The distance between who he had been and who he was becoming was not measured in years. It was measured in moments of attention. And those moments, he realized, were available every day. Winter came quietly to Seattle. The rain did not fall harder. It simply lingered longer. Mornings arrived in muted gray, and by late afternoon the sky folded into dusk. The city seemed to move more slowly, as if conserving warmth. Inside Caldwell Urban Systems, however, motion continued, measured now, but purposeful. Ethan stood in a community center gymnasium in Rainier Valley, sleeves rolled up, reviewing poster boards pinned along the walls. They displayed early renderings of the new housing complex updated with wider windows, brighter hallways, and shared garden spaces. Tonight was not a press event. It was a listening session. Folding chairs filled the basketball court. Residents, older couples, young families, retirees sat with cautious attention. Some remembered past developments that had promised inclusion and delivered displacement. Ethan took the microphone. For years, he began, I stood in rooms like this to explain projects already decided. A few heads tilted. This time, he continued, nothing moves forward without your voice shaping it. He stepped aside. The first question came from an older man with a veteran's cap. Are rents really staying affordable? He asked. Or is that just a phase? Ethan did not deflect. They are contractually locked, he said. Long-term, not promotional. A middle-aged woman stood next. My sister lost her apartment 3 years ago because of rising taxes. What guarantees do we have? No one here should fear being priced out of their own neighborhood, Ethan replied. And if we fail to uphold that, I expect to be called out. Murmurs rippled. Accountability spoken publicly had weight. In the back row, Lena watched quietly with Annie beside her. Annie swung her legs gently, listening more than speaking. When the meeting ended, several residents approached Ethan directly, some skeptical, some appreciative, none invisible. As the crowd thinned, Annie tugged at his coat. You didn't talk too much, she observed. I'm practicing, he replied. She nodded solemnly. Listening is louder. He almost laughed. Yes, he said softly. It is. Back at headquarters the following week, Ethan introduced a new initiative, community representation seats on advisory panels for major projects. Not symbolic seats, voting seats. Margaret Whitmore studied the proposal. This shifts power outward, she said. Yes, investors may resist. Investors adapt, Ethan replied. Margaret regarded him carefully. You're turning the company into something different. I'm turning it into something sustainable. She leaned back, thoughtful. For a man who once prized control above all, this is unexpected. Ethan met her gaze. I confused control with strength. And now? Now I understand that trust is stronger. That afternoon, Detective Morrison visited his office not for investigation, but for coffee. She declined sugar. You look different, she observed. Older? He asked lightly. Quieter. I think I finally understand that influence is not immunity. She sipped her coffee. Most people in your position never admit that. I nearly learned it the hardest way possible. She set her cup down. The girl, Morrison said. She changed more than one life. Yes. Make sure you don't forget that when this feels distant. He nodded. I won't. Across town, Annie sat at the kitchen table working on a school assignment titled Community Helpers. She drew a picture of a firefighter, a nurse, a teacher, and, at the edge of the page, a man holding a coffee cup. Lena glanced over. Who's that? He helps build houses, Annie said. But now he lets people help him build them. Lena smiled faintly. That's important. Annie shrugged. Everyone needs help. That evening, Ethan received a letter in the mail, handwritten, careful script. It was from one of the finance manager's spouses. It thanked him for listening when concerns were raised. It described what it meant for their family to feel that integrity mattered again. He read it twice, then placed it inside the folder he had once labeled Legacy Planning. The folder no longer contained expansion charts. It contained moments, conversations, corrections, small, steady adjustments. Months passed. The affordable housing complex rose steadily against the skyline. Glass and brick took shape. But what Ethan watched most closely were not the walls. It was the relationships forming around them. One cold Saturday morning, he invited Annie and Lena to tour the construction site. Hard hats slightly oversized, Annie walked carefully along the marked pathways. It smells like wood and dirt, she said. That's new beginnings, Ethan replied. She pointed at a row of windows. Can people see each other from there? Yes. Good, she said. So no one feels alone. Lena watched Ethan as he absorbed that quietly. He had once built towers meant to impress. Now he built spaces meant to connect. As they stood overlooking the site, Ethan felt something steady settle inside him. Not relief, not redemption, alignment. He no longer saw his company as a machine to optimize. He saw it as a structure to steward. Later that evening, as snow threatened lightly over the city, Ethan stood again on his balcony. The skyline shimmered faintly through mist. He thought about the distance between wealth and worth, between influence and integrity, between being seen and truly seeing. The gap, he realized, was not as wide as he had believed. It could be crossed by a single moment of courage, a single refusal to ignore what felt wrong. Inside his apartment, a ceramic coffee cup sat on the counterplane, unremarkable. He picked it up, inhaled the familiar scent. No fear now, only awareness. He understood something at last. Control builds walls. Attention builds bridges. And sometimes, the strongest bridge begins with a small hand knocking a cup from a table. The first snow of the season came overnight. Seattle did not often wake to white silence. But that morning the city looked softened, edges blurred, steel muted beneath a clean layer of frost. From his balcony, Ethan Caldwell watched as traffic moved more carefully than usual. Brake lights glowing like cautious embers along the roads below. Winter demanded adjustment. He had learned that. Inside Caldwell Urban Systems, the shift continued, not loud, not revolutionary, but steady. The affordable housing project in Rainier Valley had reached its framing stage. Windows were being installed larger than originally planned. Natural light had become symbolic, though no one had labeled it that. Light was simply necessary. That afternoon, Ethan visited the site again, boots crunching lightly over frozen gravel. Workers nodded as he passed, not stiffly, but familiarly now. Harold's nephew, a contractor on the job, raised a gloved hand. Windows came in yesterday. Looks good, Mr. Caldwell. Call me Ethan, he replied. The man hesitated, then nodded. Looks good, Ethan. A small shift, but meaningful. Inside one of the unfinished units, sunlight streamed through newly placed glass, illuminating exposed beams and fresh drywall. Ethan stood quietly in the center of the room. He imagined families here, conversations, arguments, laughter, not investors, lives. His phone vibrated. A message from Lena. Annie has a school assembly tomorrow. Community heroes. She wants you there. He read it twice. Community heroes. The phrase unsettled him slightly. He typed back, I'll be there. The next morning, Capitol Hill Elementary buzzed with low chatter and folding chairs scraping against polished floors. Parents filled the gymnasium, bundled in winter coats. Ethan sat near the back. No tailored suit today, just a dark sweater and coat. Mrs. Alvarez stood at the podium, glasses perched low on her nose. Our students were asked to speak about someone who made a difference in their community, she announced warmly. Children stepped forward one by one. A firefighter father, a nurse aunt, a crossing guard. Then Annie's name was called. She walked confidently to the microphone, braids tied neatly with blue ribbons. She held up a drawing. It showed a tall building again, but this time, Small figures stood not only in the windows, but outside at the door, talking to one another. "This is someone who listens now," she said clearly. Soft laughter moved through the crowd. "He used to be very busy," she continued, glancing briefly toward the back where Ethan sat. "But then he almost got very sick because someone didn't make a good choice, and now he makes better choices." The gym fell quiet. "He builds houses," she said, "but he also builds trust." The word hung gently in the air. Ethan felt something tighten in his throat. Not embarrassment. Recognition. "When grown-ups listen," Annie finished, "the whole city gets stronger." Applause rose, not loud, but genuine. Ethan did not stand. He simply clapped with everyone else. Afterward, in the hallway lined with student artwork, Annie approached him. "Did I say it right?" she asked. "You said it perfectly," he replied. Lena stood beside them, expression thoughtful. "She has a way of cutting through noise," Lena said. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "She does." Later that week, Caldwell Urban Systems finalized a new policy. Profit-sharing incentives tied not only to revenue performance, but to community impact, metrics, tenant retention rates, satisfaction surveys, environmental compliance, transparency. Investors pushed back at first, but data spoke clearly. Retention stabilized neighborhoods. Stable neighborhoods stabilized long-term revenue. Integrity and profitability were not opposites. They were aligned when structured properly. During a quarterly review call, an analyst asked bluntly, "Are you pivoting toward social enterprise branding?" Ethan replied calmly, "We are pivoting toward responsible enterprise." The distinction mattered. That evening, Detective Morrison joined Ethan for coffee at Cafe Solstice. "No case updates now, just conversation. You know," she said, stirring her cup. "Most people change temporarily after trauma. Then they drift back. And you think I might? I think it's possible." He considered that honestly. "Then I'll need reminders." She glanced toward the counter, where Annie sat doing homework while Lena closed up. "You have one." He smiled faintly. "Yes." As winter deepened, the Rainier Valley complex neared completion. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for early spring. This time, Ethan insisted the stage be level with the crowd. No elevated platform. On the final walkthrough before opening, he stood with Lena and Annie in the central courtyard, a shared green space that had replaced an originally planned parking lot. Children would play here. Neighbors would gather here. "Does it feel different?" Lena asked quietly. "Yes," he said. "How?" It feels inhabited already." Annie spun slowly in the courtyard. "It's bright," she declared. Ethan looked up. Even under gray sky, the space felt open. Light reflected off glass. Windows faced inward and outward. Nothing sealed off. That night, as snow began falling again in thin, delicate flakes, Ethan stood on his balcony once more. He thought about the phrase Annie had used. "Builds trust." Trust was not poured like concrete. It was layered. Choice upon choice. Moment upon moment. He picked up his coffee cup and inhaled. No fear. Only awareness. He understood something now that had once eluded him. Power could isolate. Attention connected. And connection, not control, was what endured. Below him, the city glowed softly beneath winter light. Somewhere in Capitol Hill, a small girl slept peacefully. And in that quiet, Ethan felt not triumph, but steadiness. The kind that came not from dominance, but from alignment. Spring arrived not with warmth, but with thaw. Seattle's snow receded into gray slush, then into rain-washed pavement. The city exhaled slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was safe to bloom again. The Rainier Valley complex was complete. Glass panels reflected a softer skyline, now one that seemed less imposing and more integrated into the neighborhoods below. Brickwork lined the lower levels, warm-toned and deliberate. The courtyard trees had been planted just days earlier, thin trunks staked upright, roots still adjusting to new soil. Growth required patience. Ethan stood inside one of the finished units the morning before the official opening. The hardwood floors were polished, cabinets installed, windows clean. He ran his hand lightly along the kitchen counter. This space would hold groceries, bills, late-night conversations, arguments about homework, apologies, whispered after pride cooled. For the first time in his career, he did not imagine resale value. He imagined continuity. A knock sounded gently on the open doorframe. Margaret Whitmore stepped in, coat folded neatly over her arm. "You look contemplative," she observed. "I'm calculating," Ethan replied quietly. She smiled faintly. "About?" "Nah. The cost." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "We've already reviewed the financials." "Not that cost." He turned toward her. "The cost of almost ignoring what mattered." Margaret's expression softened. "You can't rewrite what happened." "No," he agreed. "But I can choose what follows." They walked together into the courtyard, where final chairs were being arranged for the ribbon-cutting ceremony the next day. "Investors are watching closely," Margaret said. "Some admire the pivot. Others worry about precedent." "Precedent is inevitable," Ethan replied. "If we demonstrate stability, they'll adapt. And if they don't?" He looked out at the empty courtyard. "Then I choose stability anyway." That evening, Lena visited the site with Annie after school hours. When the space was quiet and nearly golden under the setting sun, Lee ran her fingers along the brick wall. "It doesn't feel like a project," she said thoughtfully. "What does it feel like?" Lena asked. "Like someone cared." Ethan overheard from a short distance away. The phrase settled deep. Care was invisible in spreadsheets, but it was unmistakable in experience. The next morning, the ceremony drew a modest but meaningful crowd. City officials stood alongside former residents who would be moving in that very week. Construction workers remained present, not ushered away after their labor. The stage sat level with the folding chairs. No elevated platform. Ethan stepped to the microphone, pausing briefly as he scanned the faces before him. "I once believed success was measured by height," he began calmly. "By how tall buildings reached. By how far influence extended." He glanced toward Annie, who stood near Lena at the side. "I was wrong." Silence deepened. Height without foundation collapses. Influence without integrity corrodes. He let that linger. "This community reminded me that growth must include those who sustain it." Applause rose, not explosive, but steady. After the ribbon was cut, families began touring their new units. Children ran through hallways, their voices echoing against fresh paint. Elderly couples stood by windows, hands clasped as they looked out over streets they had never wanted to leave. Ethan stepped aside, letting the moment belong to them. Detective Morrison approached quietly. "No threats?" she asked lightly. "None today," he replied. She studied him. "You handled that speech differently." "I'm not trying to persuade anymore." "What are you trying to do?" "Align." She nodded slowly. "That's harder." "Yes," he said. "It is." Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Ethan remained seated alone in the courtyard. The trees swayed gently. Wind brushed across newly planted grass. Annie approached, holding something behind her back. "What are you hiding?" he asked. She revealed a folded piece of paper. It was another drawing. This time, the building stood firmly, but a small bridge extended from its entrance toward another smaller structure across the page. "What's that?" he asked. "A bridge," she said matter-of-factly. "Between what?" "Before and after." He swallowed gently. "And who built it?" She shrugged. "Everybody." The simplicity of it struck him harder than any investor critique ever had. Everybody. Choice was rarely singular. It rippled. That evening, Ethan returned home exhausted, not physically, but emotionally full. He stood once more on his balcony, the city stretching beneath him. The skyline no longer felt like a monument to his dominance. It felt like a shared structure he was responsible to steward. His phone vibrated. An internal memo had circulated. One of his senior executives proposed expanding community advisory boards to all future developments. Voluntary, initiated without his prompting. Ethan read the message twice. The shift was no longer isolated to him. It was embedding. He set the phone down. Control once meant protecting power. Now it meant protecting values. Inside, his coffee cup rested by the sink. He lifted it. The scent rose gently. No suspicion. Only awareness. He understood something clearly now. Integrity is not a single act of courage. It is a series of quiet refusals to compromise what matters. And every day required choosing it again. Below him, headlights traced patient lines through evening traffic. Somewhere across the city, families were settling into new homes. Somewhere else, mistakes were still being made. The world had not become safer, but it had become more attentive, and attention, he had learned, was the beginning of justice. The backlash did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with silence. 2 weeks after the Rainier Valley complex opened, Ethan noticed something subtle in the boardroom, an absence of the usual warmth. Conversations ended when he entered. Eye contact shortened, laughter felt measured. Markets did not punish him, but some men did. The quarterly strategy meeting began at 9 sharp. Mahogany table, filtered morning light, coffee poured without comment. Margaret Whitmore sat to Ethan's right, steady as ever. Across from them, 3 senior board members shifted through briefing packets with unusual stiffness. Ethan began calmly. We've stabilized occupancy rates. Public response remains favorable. The Community Advisory Initiative is gaining traction. A thin man named Harold Givens cleared his throat. With respect, Harold said, voice smooth but edged. Favorable headlines don't always equate to shareholder value. Margaret's pen stilled. Ethan did not flinch. The numbers remain strong. For now, Harold replied. But increasing affordable allocations voluntarily, establishing advisory panels, we risk creating expectations we can't financially sustain. Another board member, Thomas Ridley, leaned forward. You've always been disciplined, Ethan. Calculated. Recently, it feels emotional. The word hung in the air like accusation. Ethan folded his hands. Integrity is not emotional, he said evenly. It's strategic longevity. Thomas smiled thinly. Or reputational insurance. Ethan met his gaze. If protecting communities protects our reputation, then the two are aligned. Harold shifted again. There are investors considering divestment. The room quieted. Margaret finally spoke. Those investors saw the same financials we did last quarter. Revenue is stable. Risk exposure is reduced following the internal corruption review. Harold's eyes flicked briefly toward her. And yet, perception matters. Yes, Ethan agreed. It does. He paused deliberately. That's why we will not revert to practices that nearly destroyed trust. Silence thickened. The meeting concluded without resolution. No open defiance, no support either. When the room emptied, Margaret remained seated. They're testing you, she said quietly. I know. You're holding. Yes. She studied him carefully. Are you certain? Ethan walked toward the window overlooking downtown Seattle. I spent years believing loyalty meant protecting power structures. He turned back toward her. It doesn't. What does it mean now? It means protecting people who trusted me to change. Margaret nodded slowly. Then prepare. Resistance rarely fades quietly. That afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected call from Lena. Her voice was hesitant. Mr. Friend. Caldwell, I wouldn't bother you. But Annie overheard something at school. His body stilled instinctively. What kind of something? She said a classmate mentioned their father works for your company. He told his son, you're going to lose control. That the board will correct the mistake. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Children absorbed more than adults realized. Thank you for telling me, he said gently. I don't want her caught in adult politics again, Lena added. She won't be, he assured her. After hanging up, Ethan remained seated for several minutes. Correction. The word echoed unpleasantly. Later that evening, he reviewed corporate bylaws alone in his office. Ownership percentages, voting thresholds, contingency clauses. Harold and Thomas did not have enough support to remove him outright, but reputations could be chipped away. Confidence eroded. Narratives shifted. He had survived a poisoning attempt, but political displacement required no toxins, only patience. Across town, Annie sat at the kitchen table finishing homework. Lena stirred soup on the stove, simple chicken and vegetables, the kind that filled a room with comfort. Mom, Annie asked quietly, what does loyalty mean? Lena paused. It means standing by someone when it's inconvenient, even if other people don't? Yes, Annie considered that. Then Mr. Caldwell is being loyal. Lena smiled faintly. He's learning. Annie looked down at her math sheet. People don't like when other people change. No, Lena agreed. They don't. The following morning, an article appeared in a business journal. Headline: Is Caldwell's new direction a risk to shareholders? It was carefully written, neutral on the surface, but seeded with doubt. Anonymous board sources expressed concern. Speculation circulated. Ethan read it without visible reaction. Margaret entered his office mid-morning. They're escalating. Yes. Response? He stood, adjusting his jacket. Not defensive. She raised an eyebrow. Then what? Transparent. Within hours, Ethan scheduled a public investor call. Not mandatory. Voluntary. On the call, his voice remained steady. Change invites scrutiny, he began. That is healthy. But let me be clear. Community integration strengthens asset value long-term. Reduced displacement lowers regulatory conflict. Trust builds sustainable markets. He did not raise his tone. He did not attack critics. He simply outlined facts, data, patterns, history. By the end of the call, several major investors voiced continued support. Not unanimous, but solid. Later that evening, Ethan received a short message from an unknown number. You've changed. That makes you unpredictable. Unpredictable leaders fall. No signature, no threat, just observation. He stared at it briefly before deleting it. Fear once dictated his strategy. Now it clarified it. That night, he visited Rainier Valley quietly. No announcement, no entourage. Lights glowed warmly behind apartment windows. Children's laughter drifted faintly through open air. An elderly man watered newly planted shrubs near the entrance. He looked up. You're the developer, the man said. I am. The man nodded. You kept your word. Ethan hesitated. Yes. The man returned to his watering can. That's rare. Simple words, but heavy. Loyalty to profit shifted easily. Loyalty to principle demanded endurance. Ethan walked slowly through the courtyard. He understood now that change did not end at one ceremony. It required defending. Repeatedly, quietly, and sometimes alone. But he was not entirely alone anymore. As he exited the complex, his phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Support from 3 additional institutional investors confirmed. He allowed himself a small exhale. The resistance had not vanished, but neither had his footing. Leadership, he realized, was not about commanding a room. It was about holding a line when the room grew uncertain. Back in his penthouse, he poured himself coffee. He lifted the cup, inhaled gently, still attentive, still deliberate. Power tested loyalty. Loyalty revealed character. And character once rebuilt was no longer easily shaken. The emergency board session was scheduled for 7 a.m., early enough to feel deliberate, late enough to appear procedural. Ethan arrived before anyone else. Seattle's skyline glowed pale blue beyond the glass walls, the city just beginning to stir. Ferries traced white lines across Elliott Bay. Delivery trucks moved like quiet veins through downtown arteries. He placed a leather folder on the conference table and sat. No phone, no coffee, only stillness. Margaret entered 10 minutes later. They've secured enough proxies to call a confidence review, she said without preamble. Not enough to remove me, Ethan replied calmly. No, but enough to rattle the markets. He nodded. That's the point. By 7 sharp, the room filled. Harold Givens sat opposite Ethan, posture immaculate, expression courteous but firm. Thomas Ridley avoided eye contact at first. The company's general counsel outlined the procedural language. A formal review of leadership direction. A vote of confidence. Clean. Technical. Dangerous. Harold spoke first. Ethan, no one disputes your recent moral awakening, he began smoothly. But leadership requires predictability. Investors require clarity. Since the Rainier Valley initiative, we've seen strategic shifts without full board alignment. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. Ethan waited. Harold continued. Your transparency call, your advisory expansions, your public positioning, it's admirable. But it's unilateral, Thomas added quietly. We built this company on disciplined expansion, not social experimentation. Ethan finally leaned forward. Disciplined expansion nearly cost us everything. Silence, he continued, voice steady. A senior executive attempted to poison me to manipulate a vote. That did not happen in isolation. It happened within a culture that prioritized outcome over ethics. He let the words settle. We corrected that. Harold clasped his hands. No one defends corruption, but you defend the conditions that allowed it, Ethan replied. Margaret watched the room carefully. Thomas spoke again, tone sharpened. You've shifted our mission. No, Ethan said quietly. I clarified it. He stood. For a moment, no one interrupted. We build communities, not just structures. Communities require trust. Trust requires consistency. He glanced toward the windows. You want predictability? Here it is. We will not sacrifice integrity for short-term gain. Not again. Harold exhaled slowly. And if the vote fails, then I step aside. Margaret's head turned sharply, but Ethan's gaze remained forward. If this board believes the old model serves better, I will not cling to position. The room shifted. His willingness changed the dynamic. Power that refuses to beg becomes harder to remove. The General Council distributed ballots. Paper, not digital. Waited. Deliberate. Each board member marked quietly. The scratching of pens sounded louder than expected. When the ballots were collected, silence deepened. Ethan did not check his phone. He did not pace. He simply sat. Waiting had once irritated him. Now it clarified him. The votes were counted at the head of the table. Margaret's expression revealed nothing. Finally, the council cleared his throat. Vote of confidence. Retained. A breath moved through the room. Not triumphant. Reluctant in some corners. But decisive. Harold's face remained composed. Very well, he said. Thomas leaned back, studying Ethan anew. The session adjourned without applause. As the room emptied, Margaret remained. You were prepared to walk, she said quietly. Yes. Were you certain you'd win? No. She studied him carefully. You've changed. Yes. Outside the boardroom, headlines updated within the hour. Caldwell retains leadership amid strategic debate. Markets steadied. Investors recalibrated. But something deeper had shifted. That afternoon, Ethan visited Lena and Annie. He did not announce the vote. Annie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, assembling a puzzle Seattle's skyline depicted in bright blues and greens. She looked up. Did they try to fire you? He blinked. Yes. And? They didn't. She nodded, returning to her puzzle. Good. Lena watched him carefully from the kitchen doorway. You look different, she said. Lighter, Annie added without looking up. He considered that. Maybe I am. He sat beside Annie, studying the puzzle. One piece remained missing near the top of the tallest building. She handed it to him. Put it in. He examined the shape. It fit precisely. The skyline completed. See? She said. It only works when every piece stays. He smiled faintly. Yes. That evening, he returned to Rainier Valley once more. The courtyard lights flickered on automatically at dusk. A group of teenagers played basketball on the small half-court installed near the back. An elderly woman waved from her balcony. Normal life. Unremarkable. Precious. He stood there for several minutes, absorbing the ordinary miracle of stability. Detective Morrison's words returned to him from weeks earlier. Attention is the beginning of justice. Justice was rarely dramatic. It was procedural, persistent, and often contested. But it held. Back home, Ethan stood again at his balcony. Seattle pulsed below. He understood something now with clarity that had taken decades to form. Power invites betrayal, but integrity invites resistance. And resistance, when endured, creates legitimacy. He no longer feared removal, because leadership, he had learned, was not a title secured by votes. It was a responsibility earned by consistency. His phone buzzed once more. A short message from Margaret. Stability regained, for now. He typed back. Stability built, not regained. He set the phone down. Inside, his coffee cup rested beside the sink. He washed it slowly, deliberately. The scent no longer carried fear, only memory and gratitude. Autumn returned quietly. Leaves along the streets of Seattle turned copper and gold, collecting along sidewalks in soft drifts. The air sharpened. Even the skyline seemed clearer, edges defined against a sky washed pale by colder light. It had been 1 year since the coffee spilled. 1 year since a 6-year-old girl refused to stay silent. Rainier Valley was no longer referred to as the Affordable Project. It had a name now. Harbor Point. Names mattered. They gave permanence to intention. On a cool October afternoon, Harbor Point hosted its first annual community gathering. Nothing extravagant. Folding tables, chili simmering in slow cookers, children painting pumpkins, a local jazz trio playing near the courtyard fountain. Ethan arrived without a press team. Without a speech prepared, he wore a simple navy jacket instead of a tailored suit. People greeted him by first name now. Not Mr. Caldwell, just Ethan. An elderly veteran shook his hand. Appreciate what you did here, the man said. Ethan nodded. You deserve it. The veteran studied him. Deserves a strong word. It should be, Ethan replied gently. Across the courtyard, Annie stood near the pumpkin table, her curls tied back with a bright orange ribbon. She was explaining something to two other children. Hands animated, eyes steady. Lena approached Ethan. She organized the kids, Lena said softly. Said someone had to make sure nobody felt left out. Ethan smiled faintly. She's consistent. Yes, Lena agreed. She is. He watched Annie for a long moment. A year ago, he might have mistaken her for background noise. Now, he understood that the future often arrives in small voices adults are tempted to dismiss. Annie finally noticed him watching and ran over. You're late, she announced. I was on time. She shook her head. You're supposed to help judge the pumpkin contest. He blinked. I am? Yes, you promised. He had, weeks ago, a casual agreement that had somehow become official in her mind. He followed her toward the table. Children lifted pumpkins carved with crooked smiles and lopsided eyes. One pumpkin bore a simple word carved carefully into its side. See. Ethan paused in front of it. Who made this one? He asked. A shy boy raised his hand. What does it mean? Ethan asked. The boy shrugged. My grandma says people don't see each other anymore. Ethan felt that settle in his chest. Your grandma's wise. He awarded the pumpkin a blue ribbon, not because it was the most intricate, but because it was honest. As the afternoon deepened, music drifted softly across the courtyard. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell like gentle waves. Margaret arrived briefly, walking slowly beside her husband. She surveyed the scene with thoughtful eyes. This is different from our groundbreakings, she said. Yes, Ethan replied. It feels rooted. He nodded. It is. She looked at him carefully. You could have walked away after the vote. I know. Why didn't you? He considered the answer before speaking. Because walking away would have been easier. Margaret studied him, then smiled faintly. Harder choices age better. As dusk approached, lanterns were lit around the courtyard. Warm light pooled along brick paths. Annie climbed onto a low bench and clapped her hands loudly. Okay, everyone, we have to say thank you. The crowd quieted, amused. Thank you for what? Someone called out playfully. For staying, she said. Silence followed, not awkward, but thoughtful. Lena looked at Ethan. He felt something tighten in his throat. The veteran nodded slowly. The elderly woman from the balcony dabbed at her eyes. Annie stepped down and walked back toward Ethan. You're not going anywhere, right? She asked quietly. No, he said. Good. They stood side by side as lantern light flickered. He remembered the man he had been before that morning in the cafe. Controlled, respected, feared, but distant. He had believed control ensured safety. He now understood that connection ensured meaning. Later, after the gathering thinned and the jazz trio packed up their instruments, Ethan remained seated on a courtyard bench. Leaves rustled overhead. A maintenance worker began folding chairs. Ordinary tasks, ordinary dignity. Annie sat beside him, swinging her legs. Do you still check your coffee? She asked. Yes. Good. He smiled faintly. Paying attention doesn't mean being afraid, she added. No, he agreed. It means being awake. She leaned her head briefly against his arm, 6 years old, and somehow older than the room when it mattered. Mom says people change when something scares them, Annie said. That's true. But I think people change when someone sees them, she continued. He looked down at her. Where did you learn that? She shrugged. From you. The simplicity of it humbled him more than any board vote ever could. Night settled fully over Harbor Point. Windows glowed from within, life continuing, unremarkable, sacred. Ethan rose slowly. As he walked toward his car, he glanced back once more at the courtyard. 1 year ago, coffee had shattered across tile. Rutina had broken. Control had cracked. He had thought the most important moment was surviving. He had been wrong. The most important moment was listening. He unlocked his car but did not get in immediately. Instead, he looked up at the skyline, his skyline. Once. Now it belonged to something broader. He understood at last. The distance between a billionaire and a little girl was not measured in money. It was measured in attention. The distance between power and purpose was not measured in votes. It was measured in courage. And the distance between indifference and love was one decision, made in a single moment. To see, to listen, to stay. Inside the courtyard, Annie's laughter rang out one last time before Lena called her home. Ethan allowed himself a quiet smile. Wealth had once meant acquisition, now it meant stewardship. Justice had once meant winning, now it meant protecting. And legacy. Legacy meant being remembered not for how high you built, but for who felt safe standing beside you. He got into his car and drove slowly into the Seattle night. Not above the city, but within it. This story reminds us that true power is not measured by wealth, control, or status, but by the willingness to see and protect those who are often overlooked. A single act of courage from a child who refused to stay silent became the turning point that exposed betrayal and awakened conscience. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Attention is the beginning of justice. When we choose to listen instead of dismiss, to act instead of ignore, and to stand by what is right even when it costs us, we close the distance between indifference and love. In the end, integrity is not built in boardrooms or headlines, it is built in quiet moments when we decide to do the right thing. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.